At 1:34 a.m. on March 28, 1942, in the narrow, torchlit harbor of St. Nazaire on France's Atlantic coast, the aging British destroyer HMS Campbellton surged forward at full speed, her engines screaming, her decks packed with commandos, her hull riddled with shells, and then, with a deafening crash of steel on steel, she rammed herself directly into the massive gates of the Normandie Dock, the largest dry dock on the Atlantic seaboard, carrying deep inside her bow a hidden charge of explosives set on a delayed fuse. Campbellton was no modern warship. She was a stripped-down relic disguised as a German vessel, commanded by officers who knew the ship was not meant to return and crewed by men who understood that survival was never part of the plan. Around her, more than 600 British commandos were already fighting in the darkness, trapped between concrete walls, searchlights, and German machine guns, while their escape routes burned on the water behind them. This was not an invasion, not a fleet action, not a battle meant to be won by firepower alone, but a calculated act of sacrifice designed to destroy a single dock and cripple the reach of Hitler's most feared battleship. Why would Britain gamble hundreds of lives on one old ship and one violent impact? And how could the destruction of a single structure change the course of the Battle of the Atlantic? By early 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had entered one of its most dangerous phases for Britain, as German U-boats roamed the shipping lanes with devastating efficiency and the Kriegsmarine prepared to unleash its surface raiders against Allied convoys stretched thin across the ocean. At the center of British anxiety stood the German battleship Tirpitz, sister ship of the infamous Bismarck, a 42,900-ton giant armed with 8 380mm guns, capable of shredding entire convoy escorts in minutes and forcing the Royal Navy to divert massive resources just to track her movements. Though Tirpitz spent much of the war hidden in Norwegian fjords, her mere existence tied down British capital ships and posed a constant strategic threat, because if she ever broke into the Atlantic and sustained damage, there was only one place on the entire western seaboard of occupied Europe where she could be repaired: the Normandie Dock at St. Nazaire. Built before the war to service transatlantic liners like the SS Normandie, this colossal dry dock measured over 1,100 feet in length and was protected by thick concrete caissons, heavy flak batteries, coastal guns, and thousands of German troops guarding the port and surrounding area. As long as the Normandie Dock remained operational, Tirpitz could risk Atlantic operations knowing she had a safe haven for repairs. But if the dock were destroyed, the German High Command would be forced to keep their most powerful battleship confined to northern waters, neutralized not by a naval battle, but by geography and logistics. Britain understood that destroying this dock would remove a strategic option from Hitler's arsenal without firing a single shell at Tirpitz herself. Yet conventional bombing had already proven ineffective, as the dock's reinforced concrete could absorb punishment from the air and be repaired faster than it could be destroyed. A naval assault by battleships or cruisers was equally impossible, as the heavily defended harbor lay deep within enemy territory, covered by coastal artillery and minefields designed to annihilate any traditional attack. This left British planners with a grim conclusion. If the dock could not be destroyed from a distance, it would have to be destroyed from inside, by a force small enough to slip through defenses yet powerful enough to cripple the target permanently. Thus, Operation Chariot was conceived not as a battle to be fought and withdrawn from, but as a calculated raid in which surprise, deception, and timing would replace brute force, and in which the survival of the attackers was secondary to the success of the mission. The strategic logic was brutally simple: sacrifice a ship and a few hundred men to remove a threat that could otherwise cost Britain thousands of sailors and millions of tons of shipping over the course of the war. But how do commanders convince men to volunteer for an operation where the objective is clear, the enemy is overwhelming, and the chances of coming home are vanishingly small? Operation Chariot was not born from heroism or desperation alone, but from a cold calculation made in rooms where maps, shipping losses, and projected casualty figures were weighed with ruthless honesty. Because by early 1942, British naval planners understood that the Battle of the Atlantic was being decided not only by U-boats, but by the psychological and strategic shadow cast by capital ships like Tirpitz, a shadow that forced Britain to escort convoys with overwhelming force and drained resources from every other theater of war. Air raids had failed to neutralize the Normandie Dock, and every analysis concluded the same uncomfortable truth. Unless the dock was destroyed beyond repair, the threat would persist indefinitely. This meant the mission required something unprecedented, a force that could penetrate a heavily defended port, deliver a killing blow from within, and accept catastrophic losses if necessary. The plan coalesced around the idea of using an expendable ship as a guided missile, a concept as radical as it was grim, and HMS Campbellton, an obsolete American-built destroyer transferred to Britain under the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, became the chosen vessel precisely because her loss would not cripple the fleet. Campbellton was stripped of unnecessary equipment, her profile lowered to resemble a German Mao-class torpedo boat, her bow packed with over 4 tons of high explosive encased in concrete and fitted with delayed-action fuses designed to detonate hours after impact, long after the attackers were expected to be dead or captured. The men selected to carry out the raid were drawn largely from British commando units, volunteers trained for raids, sabotage, and close-quarters combat, men who understood that their missions were never meant to be fair and rarely meant to end cleanly. Command of the naval element fell to Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty, a career officer tasked with steering Campbellton into the heart of the harbor under fire, knowing that the moment of impact would also mark the end of his ship as a fighting unit. The commando force was placed under Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Newman, a leader known for his calm resolve and blunt honesty, who addressed his men before departure with words that were later remembered for their clarity rather than their comfort, telling them plainly that many would not return and that capture or death were likely outcomes. Yet the volunteers stepped forward in large numbers, driven by a mixture of duty, camaraderie, and the understanding that this single operation could spare countless others from dying at sea in the months and years to come. Diaries and recollections reveal men wrestling quietly with the reality of the mission, writing brief letters home, joking darkly about odds, and focusing obsessively on small details of training to avoid thinking too far ahead. Because to imagine the harbor itself was to imagine a maze of concrete, steel, and guns designed specifically to kill intruders. German defenses at St. Nazaire were formidable, with coastal artillery covering the river approaches, flak towers guarding the skies, machine gun nests embedded into harbor structures, and thousands of troops stationed nearby, many of them experienced and alert after years of occupation duty. The plan relied entirely on deception and timing, with Campbellton and her escort force approaching the estuary under false identification signals, hoping to delay detection just long enough to reach the dock gates, because once the alarm was fully raised, the harbor would become a killing ground. Every man involved understood that the success of the mission depended not on prolonged fighting but on minutes, even seconds, gained through surprise, confusion, and relentless forward momentum. Training emphasized speed and destruction over survival, teaching commandos to demolish targets quickly and move on, even if their extraction points were compromised, because lingering meant annihilation. The emotional toll of this understanding was immense, yet it also forged an unusual clarity of purpose, as men accepted that fear was inevitable but hesitation was fatal. German intelligence, for its part, dismissed the possibility of such an audacious raid, believing that any British attack on St. Nazaire would come from the air or involve conventional naval forces, a miscalculation that allowed Operation Chariot to proceed under a thin veil of plausibility. Still, planners knew that even perfect execution would not guarantee survival, and contingency plans quietly acknowledged that the majority of the force might be killed or captured. What mattered was the delayed explosion inside Campbellton's bow, a ticking certainty that once the ship was embedded in the dock gates, the fate of the Normandie Dock would be sealed regardless of what happened on the surface. In this way, the operation blurred the line between military raid and calculated sacrifice, asking ordinary men to serve as the delivery system for a strategic effect far larger than themselves. As the task force sailed toward the French coast, engines humming and decks darkened, the men of Operation Chariot carried not only weapons and explosives, but the weight of a decision made far above their ranks, a decision that transformed them into the human edge of a strategic gamble. When the harbor lights of St. Nazaire finally appeared on the horizon in the early hours of March 28th, The last question left unanswered was no longer whether the dock could be destroyed, but whether any of the men sent to destroy it would live long enough to know that their sacrifice had been worth the cost. At approximately 0:30 on March 28, 1942, the small British task force slipped into the mouth of the Loire estuary under a moonless sky. Engines throttled low, decks darkened, signal lamps ready to flash false German recognition codes as HMS Campbellton led the column towards St. Nazaire, her silhouette altered to resemble a German torpedo boat, just convincingly enough to buy precious minutes. At 0:52, as the ships passed the outer defenses, searchlights flickered uncertainly and coastal guns hesitated, the deception holding just long enough for the raiders to press deeper into the river. But by 1:10 the illusion began to unravel as German gunners grew suspicious, flares arced into the sky, and the harbor erupted into life with alarms, whistles, and the thunder of artillery echoing off concrete walls. At 1:20, Campbellton increased speed, her bow cutting through tracer fire and shell splashes as machine gun rounds tore across the deck, killing and wounding sailors and commandos alike. Yet the ship held course because deviation meant failure, and at 1:34 the destroyer struck the Normandie Dock gates at full power, the impact crushing her bow deep into the steel caisson and locking the ship in place as if welded by violence itself. Within seconds, demolition teams leapt ashore under a storm of fire, their objectives clear and brutally limited by time: to destroy pumping stations, winding gear, power supplies, and control rooms before German reinforcements could overwhelm them. Between 1:40 and 2:10, the harbor became a chaotic battlefield as commandos fought at point-blank range through smoke, sparks, and ricochets, charges detonating against machinery, while German defenders poured in from barracks and guard posts, confusion spreading as officers struggled to understand how a British force had penetrated so deeply into what was believed to be an impregnable port. At 2:15, the first reality of the plan's fragility became undeniable when the motor launches assigned to evacuate the raiders were systematically destroyed by concentrated fire, burning on the water and leaving survivors clinging to debris as the possibility of escape collapsed in real time. By 2:30, isolated pockets of British commandos were fighting independently, some attempting to reach prearranged rally points that no longer existed, others choosing to make last stands to cover their comrades, the sound of small arms fire echoing endlessly through the dockyard corridors. As dawn approached around 3 o'clock, German forces regained partial control of the port, capturing exhausted survivors and killing those who resisted, while Campbellton sat immobile in the dock gates, her deck littered with bodies, her shattered superstructure drawing curious attention from German soldiers and civilians alike. The delayed action explosives hidden in her bow remained silent, their ticking unheard amid the noise and confusion, and this silence proved fatal for the defenders, because by mid-morning on March 28, German officers and workers had begun to gather aboard the wreck, inspecting the strange ship wedged into the dock, unaware that the mission's true climax had not yet occurred. At approximately 10:35, more than 9 hours after the ramming, the explosives detonated with catastrophic force, obliterating the dock gates, hurling debris hundreds of meters, killing scores of Germans instantly, and rendering the Normandie Dock completely unusable, its massive structure twisted beyond repair. The blast shocked Street Nazaire into stunned silence, transforming what had seemed like a repelled raid into a strategic disaster for the occupying forces, as the full scale of the damage became clear only hours later. For the British, scattered survivors in captivity would learn of the explosion through rumors and distant thunder, realizing that the plan had worked even as they faced years of imprisonment. In the span of less than 12 hours, Operation Chariot had achieved its objective at an appalling cost, destroying the only Atlantic dock capable of servicing tirpitz and proving that a single, perfectly timed act of destruction could outweigh the loss of ships, men, and certainty. Yet as the smoke drifted away from the shattered dock and the harbor returned to uneasy order, the question lingered among both victors and captives alike. Could any success truly justify a night in which so many lives were spent as currency for minutes of time and a single, irreversible explosion? When the smoke cleared over Street Nazaire and the scale of the destruction became undeniable, Operation Chariot revealed itself not as a failed raid salvaged by luck, but as one of the most strategically effective single-night actions of the entire war, because the annihilation of the Normandie Dock removed, in an instant, the only Atlantic repair facility capable of servicing Tirpitz or any future German capital ship damaged far from home waters. German engineers quickly concluded that the dock was beyond rapid repair, its gates destroyed, its structure warped, and its machinery shattered so completely that restoring it under wartime conditions was impractical, effectively sealing Tirpitz's fate as a fleet and being confined to the Norwegian fjords for the remainder of the war. This outcome validated the brutal logic behind the raid, as British planners calculated that the loss of one old destroyer and hundreds of elite troops had prevented a far greater catastrophe, sparing untold numbers of Allied sailors who would otherwise have faced the battleship's guns in the open Atlantic. Yet this strategic success came at a staggering human cost, with over half of the raiding force killed or captured, many dying in the harbor during the withdrawal or spending the rest of the war in German prison camps. Their victory known only through rumors, delayed reports, and the distant echo of an explosion they never witnessed. For those taken prisoner, Operation Chariot became a defining memory, a moment when they understood that their suffering had been deliberately factored into the plan, not as an afterthought, but as an acceptable price for success, a realization that weighed heavily in the years of captivity that followed. On the German side, the raid exposed vulnerabilities that had been assumed impossible, shaking confidence in coastal defenses and forcing the diversion of additional troops, guns, and resources to protect ports across occupied Europe, resources that could no longer be used elsewhere. The shock of the delayed explosion, killing German officers and workers who had gathered around the wrecked ship, added a psychological dimension to the disaster, reinforcing the sense that British forces were capable of striking deep inside supposedly secure territory with devastating precision. In Britain, news of the raid was initially muted, both to protect operational details and to manage public expectations, but when the full story emerged, Operation Chariot was recognized as a rare example of a raid that achieved exactly what it set out to do, and those who had taken part were honored accordingly, with 5 Victoria Crosses awarded and countless acts of individual bravery formally acknowledged. More importantly, the raid left a lasting imprint on military doctrine, demonstrating the power of special operations to achieve strategic effects disproportionate to their size, influencing later Allied planning from commando raids to airborne assaults, and shaping the post-war development of elite units trained to operate behind enemy lines. St. Nazaire itself became a symbol of this transformation, a place where infrastructure, rather than armies, had been identified as the decisive target, and where the line between naval warfare and sabotage blurred into something new. Yet beyond doctrines and decorations, the true legacy of Operation Chariot lay in its moral complexity, because it forced a confrontation with an uncomfortable truth about modern war. That victory often depends on decisions made far from the battlefield, decisions that knowingly place ordinary men in situations from which they are not expected to return. For the survivors, both free and captive, the knowledge that their sacrifice had achieved its purpose offered some measure of meaning, but it could not erase the memories of burning boats, fallen comrades, and a harbor lit by gunfire and dawn. As historians look back on the raid, it stands not only as a testament to ingenuity and courage, but as a stark reminder that strategic brilliance and human tragedy are often inseparable, bound together in moments where success is measured not by survival, but by the irreversible change left behind in steel, concrete, and lives forever altered. With the Normandie Dock lying silent and broken, the Atlantic a little safer, yet no less unforgiving, one final question remained unresolved. When a war demands sacrifices calculated in advance, who truly bears the weight of the victory that follows? Long after the gunfire faded and the waters of St. Nazaire settled back into uneasy calm, the wreck of HMS Campbellton remained embedded in memory as much as it had once been embedded in steel, a silent reminder that some victories are designed to be won only once and at any cost. The men who sailed into the harbor on that March night did not change the course of the war through numbers or firepower, but through the willingness to accept a fate already calculated for them by necessity and strategy. turning an obsolete ship in a handful of minutes into a weapon more powerful than any battleship. Operation Chariot did not end the Battle of the Atlantic, nor did it save every convoy that followed, but it removed a single, decisive option from Hitler's arsenal and proved that even the most heavily guarded strongholds could be undone by imagination, timing, and resolve. For those who died in the harbor, and for those who survived only to spend years behind barbed wire, the victory was never something they could celebrate in the moment, yet its consequences echoed far beyond their own lives, shaping naval strategy and special operations doctrine for generations to come. The shattered dock gates of St. Nazaire became a symbol of how modern war often demands sacrifices that cannot be fully understood until long after the smoke has cleared, and how the line between courage and calculation is rarely clean or comfortable. As the Atlantic convoys continued to sail, carrying food, fuel, and soldiers toward distant fronts, they did so under a sky made marginally safer by a mission few would ever know in detail and fewer still would ever volunteer to repeat. At 1:34 a.m., one ship rammed one dock and sealed its own fate, but in doing so it forced history to turn ever so slightly away from catastrophe and toward survival. And as we remember Operation Chariot today, the question it leaves us with is not simply how such a mission succeeded, but whether we truly understand the human price paid by those who ensured that it did.